Minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to deliver the Ministerial report on public housing reform in the Northern Territory, which was notified on Wednesday the 19th of March. I move that the report be noted. Madam Speaker, one of our key focuses this year is public housing reform. Public housing is essential. It provides safe, affordable homes for low-income and vulnerable individuals and families right across the Territory. It helps reduce homelessness, supports economic participation and ensures access to essential services. What has happened over the last 8 years is the erosion of acceptable behaviour in public housing, a loosening of holding tenants to account and adherence to policies, plans and procedures that have become outdated. It is no secret that antisocial behaviour and serious incidents of crime in public housing have risen to an unacceptable level, as has the level of rent arrears. Madam Speaker, we are fully aware of what is going on and are focused on dealing with the root causes of crime when it comes to public housing and crime around the Territory. But firstly, I want to tell you a story. It's not a children's fairy tale, but a factual account. The inaction towards antisocial behaviour can be traced back to the wishy-washy philosophical ideology left behind by Labor to water down accountability. Under Labor's 8-year term, there was a serious lack of consequences. Public housing tenants who caused repeated disturbances, threatened their neighbours, threatened each other and blatantly disregarded community standards with drunken screaming and yelling and fighting were allowed to remain in public housing with little to no repercussions. You have heard me talk in this House before about the tenants with 62 red card demerit points as an example. A total of 203 reports of antisocial behaviour were recorded for a previous tenancy they held. Rather than being held accountable, they were relocated to a 3-bedroom house in May 2024. Since then, Madam Speaker, 158 reports of antisocial behaviour have been recorded at that particular tenancy. How is this fair to the decent, hard-working families and pensioners on the public housing waitlist? It's not fair. Residents from a suburb in the Greater Darwin region submitted a petition to the former Labor Housing Minister in June 2019 complaining of parties, drunken behaviour, fights and threats of violence to those neighbours. The tenant was moved to another property where similar behaviour continued. Neighbours reported not feeling safe in their very own home, living in fear and an inability to go to work or take their children to school due to a lack of sleep. One tenant was moved 3 times with taxpayers footing a bill of nearly $83,000 on transfers and modifications to properties, and yet another refused to relocate from a property despite it being deemed unsafe. Meanwhile, the percentage of complaints where antisocial behaviour was substantiated dropped by more than half, from 48% in 2019-2020 to just 22% in 2022 and 23. These case histories and statistics are just the tip of the iceberg. Law-abiding Territorians have been forced to endure neighbours from hell, while the system under Labor bent over backwards to accommodate those who repeatedly broke the rules. Another rule that has been repeatedly broken is paying rent. The current state of rental arrears across the Northern Territory public housing portfolio, as I mentioned earlier this week, is absolutely appalling. I'll recap. On the 7th of December 2021, Cabinet, at the time, under Labor, considered the submission of the Remote Public Housing Rental Framework and approved a policy position to waive the entire remote rent debt balance of $69.71 million. The waiver was on the basis that it was considered irrecoverable. In just the 2.5 years since that write-off, housing is now carrying an accumulated rental arrears debt of over $39 million. I repeat, rental arrears has now accumulated to $39 million. An astonishing 1,422 tenancies across the full urban Northern Territory social housing portfolio currently have accumulated debt of over $10,000. The highest is $40,000, followed by a couple at $36,000, another at $34,000, there's one at $39,000. I stopped asking after that. 1,422 tenancies have an accumulated debt of over $10,000. This is clearly unacceptable. What I haven't stopped asking since then is what could have some of this recovered money delivered to improve the lives of so many Territorians. Unacceptably, all of this happened while there has been an 8 to 10 year wait list for public housing here in the Northern Territory. It's been a never-ending story, this compassion without consequences approach left behind by Labor. The CLP has said 2025 will be a year of action, certainty and security, and this includes making public housing safer and more secure. We are putting a stop to 8 years of Labor inaction. There will be no more slaps on the wrist, no more sympathy without safeguards. Already there has been an increase in substantiations of antisocial behaviour. From the 1st of July 2024 to 31 December 2024, there were 5,060 reports of antisocial behaviour across the Northern Territory, of which 1,081 were substantiated, an increase of 844 reports and 451 substantiations when compared to the previous reporting period. Madam Speaker, we appreciate some public housing tenants are vulnerable due to mental health issues and domestic violence incidents, and we are not about to turf people onto the streets. But there needs to be more balance. The scales need to be tipped back towards individual accountability and responsibility for the well-being of all Territorians and security and safety of communities. Our action plan for public housing reform includes strengthening policy to fast-track the pathways to eviction, full review of the visitor management, tenancy management and red card policy, debt management policy reform, review of the Housing Act 1982 to align with community expectations. We will be making recommendations to the Attorney-General's Office for changes to the Residential Tenancies Act to also align with community expectations. Public housing reform will empower our staff to refine processes to deal with antisocial behaviour and tenancy termination, ensuring these matters are well prepared, supported by strong evidence and aligned with legislative requirements. Our reform includes short and long-term measures over the next 6 to 9 months. Strengthening the red card policy to align accountability for excessive rent debts, untidy yards, property damage and ongoing antisocial behaviour. Madam Speaker, strengthening the capacity of the CEO in housing to deal with multiple and serious breaches of tenancy agreements swiftly. Updating the termination of tenancy policy, including requiring tenants with ongoing antisocial behaviour issues to undertake supported accommodation programs and provide at least 2 rental references to determine they had passed programs such as the ability to sustain a tenancy and manage visitors prior to regaining eligibility for public housing. Updating the tenant damage policy to implement processes to effectively deal with tenants who are damaging or failing to maintain public housing properties. Review of the Department's tenancy agreement policy to implement a structured leasing model aligned to interstate jurisdictions, rather than the current automatic lapse from a 6-month to a periodic agreement. Examples include an initial 6-month probationary agreement, then a 1 to 2 year lease agreement, and then a graduation to a 5 to 10 year agreement. We'll be reviewing transferring tenants with demonstrated antisocial behaviour to consider termination for tenancies with ongoing antisocial behaviour. Transferring tenants is not an option. In addition to the use of acceptable behaviour agreements and the red card demerit point system, we will introduce statutory breach notices where tenants are required to maintain a period of compliance and not breach their tenancy agreement. Streamlining and strengthening policy to fast-track the pathways to eviction. Cases before the Northern Territory Civil and Administrative Tribunal, commonly known as NTCAT, can take from 6 months to a year with the option of appeals. Ensuring that all required information is gathered before submission is critical to preventing delays in the NTCAT process and improving the likelihood of successful outcomes. Madam Speaker, we are reviewing the tenancy management policy and visitor management policy to empower our outstanding frontline housing staff. Priorities include additional clauses to the standard tenancy agreement that requires a tenant to engage with support services due to antisocial behaviour, failure to maintain, rent arrears, and if not, it can be considered as a breach of the tenancy agreement and action taken. Reinforcement of a tenant's accountability for managing their visitors and consider action that can be taken for unapproved visitors. Updating the complaints policy and processes to introduce a minimum threshold for investigation and confirm a zero-tolerance approach to staff abuse by tenants. Amending the extended absence policy to prevent longer-term incarcerated tenants from retaining their tenancy and ensuring that tenants approved for extended absences must maintain the condition of the property in their absence. Working with the Fines Recovery Unit and the Northern Territory Police to develop procedures to support public housing safety officers, to use their legislated powers to issue and enforce infringements to tenants engaging in antisocial behaviour and other prescribed offences on public housing premises. Working with Licensing NT to seek approval from the Registrar to deem the common areas of public housing complexes with ongoing antisocial behaviour issues as alcohol-restricted premises, without the requirement to gain majority tenant agreement. Update signage on the common areas of public housing complexes to advise that trespassing is prohibited so that public housing safety officers can issue notices of direction to trespassers in line with their powers to act, including the Trespass Act and the Housing Act 1982. We are working on developing a memorandum of understanding with the NT Police and the Department of Children and Families to improve the complaints, mandatory reporting processes and compliance activities. We will explore options for a joint complaints process that prevents the requirement for complainants to report antisocial behaviour, criminal behaviour and child safety concerns to 3 separate departments. This process needs to be streamlined. We will be putting greater accountability onto tenants to ensure rent is paid or rental arrears are at least diligently pursued. Current policy allows a person to apply for housing with no limit to the debt and does not specify a debt amount that triggers the CEO to review the debt. The debt management policy states that the policy detail, a client with a debt must be making repayments on the debt before the housing assistance will be provided. However, without further stipulation, this allows a new tenant to set up an agreement to pay the week after allocation and cancel several weeks in. Our proposed actions include a client with previous debt must sign an agreement to pay, if not existing at the time of submitting their application. An application would not be approved if the agreement to pay defaults before assessment and approval. An applicant must have paid a minimum 30% of their debt prior to being offered housing and cannot have more than $1,500 in debt at the time of allocation. We will review debt exceeding $1,500 and seek termination for rent debt of $5,000 or more if there is ongoing non-payment of rent and debts. We will review the threshold of rental arrears when tenancies are referred to housing compliance to issue a notice to remedy, currently set at 21 days rental arrears. Debt validation process review, including training for relevant staff to provide a clear expectation of applicants and tenants who owe debt to the department. There will be a review of compliance processes to ensure a streamlined pathway to issue a notice of remedy or lodge an initiating application with NTCAT. Finally, we are reviewing the Housing Act 1982 and seeking recommendations from the Attorney-General's Office for the Residential Tenancies Act 1999 to both strengthen and align with community expectations. Madam Speaker, one proposal under consideration is increasing the powers of public housing safety officers, which I've previously mentioned. These provisions sit under the Housing Act 1982. It is recommended they are provided with similar powers of transit safety officers under the Public Transport Passenger Safety Act clauses 26, 27 capital A, 27 capital B, 27 capital C and section 28. Madam Speaker, we also want to determine if public housing safety officers can have increased powers to issue banned drinker orders in line with the NT Police. Madam Speaker, in summary, we will ensure legislation and public housing policies are tightened and enforced properly, and we will be backing our hard-working staff 100%. We will not expect them to turn a blind eye to unacceptable behaviour, but will take into account the required training and additional resources needed to carry out this important work. Our housing staff are out there to ensure compliance. They are not meant to be doubling up as social workers. Some of these changes will occur within 6 months, others may require a little longer. The important thing, Madam Speaker, is we are taking action. Antisocial behaviour, serious incidents of crime, rental arrears in public housing have been allowed to spiral out of control for far too long. The time for excuses and rolling out the red carpet for repeat offenders is over. There'll be no more compassion without consequences. There'll be no more slaps on the wrist, no more putting up with tenants that are disturbing their neighbours, committing offences, committing antisocial behaviour, playing music to all hours of the day and night, keeping hard-working people up at night, preventing children from getting the sleep that they need to go to school. Enough is enough, Madam Speaker. I've travelled the Territory now. I've travelled through Alice Springs, Tennant Creek, Katherine, the Greater Darwin region, and it's of great concern to me the amount of complaints that I hear about antisocial behaviour in public houses and in public unit complexes. I do want to reiterate there are many good tenants out there. We need to keep that in mind, that there are many, many good public housing tenants out there. But we can no longer allow those that want to disrupt the privacy, the safety and security of others in neighbourhoods throughout the Northern Territory. We will rein in the debt and we will take action to ensure that the antisocial behaviour is dealt with swiftly and in accordance with new policy and legislation. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Gwadja.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I too rise to speak to the ministerial report provided by the Northern Territory Housing Minister. And of course, housing is one of the most important aspects to a healthy, stable and thriving community. And I want to acknowledge that for a number of Territorians living across the Northern Territory, housing is a difficult space. It's a difficult space to access, it's a difficult space to maintain, but housing is a fundamental right for all Territorians. And having access to a good quality home is very important. And we've seen that over a number of years the rolling out of investments between the Northern Territory Government and the Commonwealth to improve the living conditions for many people in the Northern Territory, giving them access to a safe, secure and affordable home is incredibly important. We've seen in our homelands, we've seen our remote communities, our urban centres and in our cities, the need to provide access to good housing is incredibly important. Now, about 6% of the Northern Territory's population experience homelessness. Madam Speaker, 13 times more than any other jurisdiction do Territorians experience homelessness. So it is incredibly important. But what we've heard this morning is this is a government with no plan to actually overcome the social determinants that cause homelessness. You've had a minister come in here taking the opportunity to demonise a large portion of our community who experience financial hardship and homelessness for a variety of reasons. And we have heard members in this chamber rejoicing when the minister talks about evicting people and addressing punitive measures to people. Well, newsflash, when you evict people from a home, when you kick them out with providing no service, no support, where do they end up? They end up on the streets in the Northern Territory. They end up on the front on the footsteps. They end up sleeping on the front entryways of shopping centres, like the member for Karama continues to remind this parliament. They end up in our parks. They end up having to go and live with other family members, then causing pressures on that family unit, on that household. The best way to overcome the challenges, Madam Speaker, is actually to invest in the social determinants, is actually to invest in Territorians. If people have issues with paying the rent, then work with them to do payment plans, to understand financial literacy, to understand how they can make it better rather than just simply kicking people out. If there's issues with overcrowding, then work with people to support people to look at alternative accommodation options. Because when you evict someone from a house, they end up on the streets or they end up having to go to possibly another public housing complex and stay with family, thereby putting pressure on. You're not actually addressing anything. You're just perpetuating the cycle of disadvantage and homelessness. The best way to overcome these challenges is to actually invest in people, invest in housing. Now, the minister has spoken in here, and he's spoken for almost 20 minutes talking people down, not actually providing any productive solution to the housing issues that we face in the Northern Territory. The minister did not talk about why we have not seen the second lot of tenders go out for the transition of public housing stock to social and community housing providers. The minister has not committed to renewing the Northern Territory's homelessness strategy when it ends this year in June. The minister has not told Territorians why the tenders have not been released on the development of Shea Street. The minister has not spoken about why they dropped the targets to provide less housing in the national partnership agreements in the Northern Territory. The minister has just come in here to make a statement so that he can go back out and look like he is talking tough on the issues that people are facing in the Northern Territory. What we absolutely need is to work together on a whole series of reform that absolutely empowers people to have more control and more of a say in their lives. We've heard firsthand from many people, even in our local communities, that they need help with managing their tenancy. That's how you can help someone sustain a home and manage a home, is by providing intensive family support for Territorians to have a safe, healthy and thriving tenancy. Because There's been no conversation in here from the minister today about what happens when you evict a tenant who has a family and they've got nowhere to go. You're putting that family, you're putting those children, our children, you're forcing our children potentially onto the streets because there's nowhere for them to go. Domestic and family violence. You heard from the member for Nightcliff who spoke recently in a speech in this parliament talking about Rocket, who's been a strong advocate of the Justice Reform Initiative, talking about how many women in the Northern Territory have to face homelessness because they've been unable to maintain tenancies because they haven't had the support that they've needed. These are all things that we can do to help people maintain those tenancies. Now, the Northern Territory is very unique. I will absolutely acknowledge that in our housing story. As the member for Mulka highlighted and pointed out yesterday, we have homelands and outstations. And we do need more houses on those homelands and outstations, because when we invest in those homelands and outstations, we absolutely create thriving places for people to be back on country, away from the humbug, away from community infighting, away from being involved in family issues that they don't want to be involved in. They can be back on country, thriving and surviving. And I want to acknowledge that there is money that has been given to the Northern Territory government by the Commonwealth to invest in homelands across the Northern Territory. And I haven't heard from the minister today about where is that money going and why are there not new homes on homelands, because the minister, Malarndirri McCarthy, the federal minister, provided additional funding to the Northern Territory government to be able to build homes on homelands. It was the CLP government that cashed out, that took money to maintain homelands. They sold remote Territorians out when it comes to homelands. Now, the minister can come in here and talk about all of this great stuff, but let's not forget that a large number of homelessness in the Northern Territory was driven largely because there were not being enough homes built in the Northern Territory's remote communities when the CLP was last in government. In the last 2 years of the CLP, and I hope you're listening, Member for Katherine, because in the last 2 years of the CLP's time in government, under Adam Giles and Bess Price, the failed Northern Territory Housing Minister, she built one new house in the last 2 years of her term in office. One new house in the bush. So you wonder why remote Territorians were travelling in and having to stay with family and friends over that time. Because there wasn't that investment. Now, absolutely, there should always be, and there's always going to be, the need for continued investment, Madam Speaker, into housing. We have transitioned we had transitioned 500 public housing dwellings in the Greater Darwin region to 2 community housing providers, Missions Australia NT and Venture Housing, and they both do a fantastic job. That did represent the first large-scale transfer of government assets under long-term leasing arrangements to the community housing sector. There was legislation passed in this parliament around the Housing and Related Legislation Amendment Act, which introduced legislative arrangements and a regulatory framework to facilitate the smooth transition of public housing tenancies to community housing providers. Now, that was to support the growth of the diverse and sustainable social housing system in the Northern Territory, Madam Speaker, because we all acknowledge that government is not a good service provider. Government is not the best person or the best entity placed to help people thrive and survive in public housing. We've got amazing social and community housing providers in the Northern Territory, and we do all need to continue to invest in and support them and that transition. That did start the transfer of 1,100 public housing dwellings to the community and social housing sector. Again, there was that $6 billion in funding for remote housing, which at last count, under the former Labor government, saw 1,413 houses had been built so far, 1,820 had been upgraded, a bit more than when the CLP were last in government. Now, Madam Speaker, of course, we want to see social and community housing across the Territory. That's why we need to continue to see that money being rolled out across the Northern Territory. That's why we need to continue to support social and community housing in the Northern Territory. What we don't need to see is a punitive approach that isn't actually going in and supporting people to maintain tenancies. No one is saying that people should not have consequences for poor behaviour and poor actions, but simply kicking people out and putting them on the streets is actually bad policy, because it's absolutely not addressing any of the root causes that are causing or escalating that level of inappropriate behaviour. Helping people into healthy programs, housing programs, addressing addictive behaviour programs, money matters programs, they are all programs that will absolutely address and begin to address the bad behaviour. That's what we need to be seeing, not making more people homeless, Madam Speaker. Now, Madam Speaker, it is incredibly important, and we do acknowledge that there needs to be that investment, and the Commonwealth Government have made that investment through the have to, which is around ensuring that we're accessing, allocating new housing and providing funding. So that is incredibly important, that we need to continue to see that. But what we don't need to continue to see, Madam Speaker, is just tough words that are not going to deliver any action. That's not going to change. That is only going to move the problem on. If you're evicting someone from a suburb in Darwin, chances are they're going to pop up in another suburb in Darwin, and they're going to actually then put pressure on someone else and their tenancy. And then under these rules that the Housing Minister spoken about this morning, then you're going to pick on that other person and that other tenancy, and then they're going to become evicted. And then suddenly you're going to have 25 people in a 3-bedroom or a 2-bedroom unit in a suburb. You have perpetuated that problem. You have enabled that problem to happen, rather than addressing and supporting the individual to correct the behaviour, to come down on top of that. An idea that I spoke to the Housing Minister about was nearly everyone here, apart from probably the Bush members, has public housing complexes with multiple people living in them. I have said to the Housing Minister, and I have had those conversations, look at clearing out one of those units and look at addressing and working with the community housing sector to have a caretaker live in these complexes so that they can be reporting and addressing behaviours when they appear to be escalating. Imagine having a public housing complex where you've got someone living in there who's able to say to government, to contact and work with the police and say, look, there is behaviour escalating over the last 3 days or 2 days or 12 hours. Oh, look, this unit, the children haven't been to school for 3 days. Let's actually work with education to get the kids to school. These are ideas that will absolutely, and I believe, are much more beneficial than evicting people and taking people through the fines recovery unit. They're measures that can help. Checking in on people, working with people, addressing those behaviours, having people be caretakers. The Minister's spoken about supporting the department staff more. We absolutely will support any measure that supports the staff in the agency to feel empowered, to have those conversations with their staff and their tenants. This is an important issue. No one's denying that. There are different ways, we believe, at addressing this critical issue, and we have always said that we believe that supporting and transferring to community housing providers is one of the best ways that you can do it. And having staff who can understand the barriers, the challenges, but also the relationships is incredibly important. One of the most effective tools I've seen, Madam Speaker, is when you have community housing providers and they have a large number of Aboriginal Territorians working for them to help people manage tenancies. They can go in and have those conversations, whether it be in language or whether it be around them and their understanding of the cultural inclusions and the barriers, and addressing those is incredibly important. But that's one of the ways that we address housing, Madam Speaker, is not by making more people homeless, but is by empowering people, doing the intensive family support, getting better. And I don't think there's been a government in the Northern Territory's history that has ever got this right. So there is an opportunity for this government and for future governments to really fine-tune that, is to have agencies talking to one another more. One of the issues we do here is when we are visiting people and they talk about the issues and they say, I've reported this to police 10 times, 20 times, and then you talk to the housing staff and they know nothing about it. Well, we don't know that. There is an opportunity here through what the Minister's talking about is to draw better communication and information sharing across agencies. So child protection and police should have an absolutely seamless and strong connection with the housing department, so that we can make sure that our kids have access to good homes, so that they can get a good night's sleep, so that they can get up and go to school the next day, and so that if people are calling the police, that the housing department can be made aware of the issues. Because the Minister's talked about people whinging. Well, if they're talking to the wrong agency, that information's not being shared, and then housing is copying it because we've reported this to police, but housing don't know about it. This is the importance of having good information sharing. This was the original reason why the former government tried to put Territory Families and Housing together into one department, was to try something different and try and have it so that children and housing were together, so that our kids had access to a good house. We need to be looking at lifting people out of poverty as well. As I've said in this parliament, and I say it again, some of the issues, I'm not saying that it's the reason why there is a rental debt. We absolutely need to address that. But when people are breached and then cut off from social welfare, they're not able to pay their rent because they're not getting any social benefit. They're not getting any assistance. So then that rental debt starts to accumulate because they've been cut off from Centrelink. They don't have any access to money. Or if there's a death in the family, or if they're providing for lots of people in their family unit, they need to support that. So the best way that we can do that is intensive tenancy support, education around financial literacy and numeracy, lifting people out of poverty, having agencies share information better, and building more houses in the Northern Territory. What we don't want to see, Madam Speaker, is coming in with a big stick and hitting people and kicking people out onto the street. That is only going to perpetuate the issue of homelessness. It's only going to create more of a problem, because more people will be homeless, more people will be forced to sleep in parks, in alleyways, in empty houses, on the doorsteps of shopping centres and in shopping centres. We need to review the housing strategy. These are all important aspects that we haven't heard the Minister talk about.
Member for Drysdale.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, it amazes me that the opposition still cling to this ideology. We heard about homelessness. I have homelessness occurring in Drysdale from working families who have had to sell their property to get out. They just cannot handle how bad the behaviour has gotten and are now living in temporary accommodation. They've had to sell at massively reduced prices, and they are now looking to re-enter the market somewhere else, and they will have less money in their pocket to do so. As I have started this journey, even when I was campaigning, I quickly learnt throughout the entire electorate, housing is a major issue in every suburb. I have endless examples, and the examples are truly, they are horrific. I have horrific cases occurring in Drysdale. I have some properties where we've had violent crime almost on a weekly basis, and it's been ongoing for 2.5 years. And then the tenant before that, at this particular address, they had the same problems for 6 years. And so we have residents who are just living in an absolute nightmare. Home has not been a place of retreat. Home has only been a place of suffering for a very long time. I'm currently a nurse has come to me, and she is living next to a housing tenant who blasts loud music and drinks almost every single night. And she has to get up and go to the hospital where she serves NT patients, and that is what she is dealing with every night. I hear the same thing from teachers. It is just across the board. And so when I speak today, I look at how did we actually get to this point? How did it get to a point in Drysdale where we have the foundation for a beautiful suburb? We have large blocks in Driver and Grey, large open spaces, mature greenery, amazing primary schools, and it's right next to the CBD. The electorate of Drysdale, families should be pushing over each other to get into that market, and we should be seeing nice house growth in their prices, but we're seeing the exact opposite. And because of that, we're all poorer, and we have, because of policy, long-term policy has created ghettos, and that is simply it. I have 17.1% of public housing in the Greater Darwin region in my electorate, and it is concentrated mainly in Grey and Southern Driver. And so I have many residents who bought there. They are good families who have worked, paid their taxes, and now they are surrounded in just chaos and are now dealing with the fact that they are looking at retirement and have had no return on their nest egg being their home. I also have the crushing effect this has on so many housing tenants. The amount of tenants that come to my office weekly requesting a transfer out of Drysdale because of these problems. They want to go to a suburb where there won't be alcohol, drug use, screaming, fighting. I've driven around whilst doing my electorate rounds. The amount of times I've called 000, I've actually lost count of. It would be so immense as I drive around and I see people fighting with machetes, I see open drug use, open partying. Yes, it beggars belief how we got here. And so we have vulnerable tenants throughout housing. I have a lot of young women who have families who do not feel safe. They simply do not feel safe in their house. They deserve to feel safe in their public housing home. It's having an effect on residents who are both renting and owners. And in Grey particularly, I have Sin City, which is a large complex, and I'll use its colloquial name because that is what it is referred to by everybody, including those that live there. This is 62 apartments right across from a primary school where I believe it was last year we had over 1,300 reports to police. That is so immense. Multiple times a day, police are being called to that tenant block. It'll be a good day in Drysdale, Madam Speaker, when a wrecking ball goes through Sin City. In Southern Driver, I had a single mum recently just have to leave. She couldn't put up with it. She had been in housing, she got a job, and was then very proud to start privately renting for her and her children. After 12 months, Madam Speaker, she's had to leave. And so here's a young woman trying to get ahead in life, and because of poor public planning under Labor's 19 years of this century, they have just destroyed our community. Madam Speaker, we have a strong need for housing in Drysdale. It's immense, and I want to be giving people a house so they can be safe, so they can raise their children. I have an immense amount of single mums that come in and families, and I hate to say that they're on an 8 to 10 year wait list. And that is why I support these reforms. In the short term, Madam Speaker, I do want hard rules. I do want hard rules because it is a minority that are causing these problems. As I've said, majority of my housing tenants themselves want these reforms. And that's how I know we're doing the right thing, because they are telling me they want the reforms. They want to be safe in their neighbourhood. They don't want their kids seeing this stuff when they go to school each morning. They are trying to get ahead in life, and I'm going to support them get ahead in life, Madam Speaker. In the long term, we heard about we're only using the stick. Well, I do believe in the carrot and the stick, and I don't have an issue using the stick, Madam Speaker, but I will also back any measure for incentives. I would love to see home ownership a reality for good and long-term tenants, and I would support measures into the future so that public housing tenants who look after their home, they look after the community and engage, have a path to home ownership. I also want more land releases and developments with new and dispersed housing models to increase the supply. And this way, when we increase the supply in a dispersed, new, well-planned model, we can then lower the supply in ghettos that Labor has created in Drysdale. And I would like to see that through selling off of old stock, Madam Speaker, and have a better spread and dispersed model. I believe in investing in affordable housing, and I think this is something we could do with selling of old stock, and something that would work well in Drysdale is affordable housing. We've spoken of visitor management, and I do think that our government, and we will look to any measure, can look at how we can information share across different agencies and departments so that the people in Drysdale, when reporting issues, can have a smoother streamline. However, instead of focusing on the reporting, Madam Speaker, our government will hit the cause. If you're going to cause problems in Drysdale, you will not get to hold on to your home. If you are a good tenant, we will want to reward you, Madam Speaker. And as we go through, there are some protections which our government is very mindful of. It has become very clear to me that especially young women are particularly vulnerable in the electorate. And it is something that myself and the Minister are acutely aware of, that you can have a young mum and she may have visitors come in from community and have no say in that, in the use of her property. And that is something myself and the Minister are very aware of, and we will look to also protect vulnerable people in the community. So, I've run out of time, Madam Speaker, but I'm very pleased to hear the Minister's report and support him fully. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Are there any other speakers? Member for Fanny Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm really happy to be standing here today to talk about these reforms. If you'd just indulge me for one moment, I just wanted to read out some details from the red card policy from the former Labor government, and it's about managing antisocial behaviour. So the statement says that the Department of Territory, Families, Housing and Communities takes public housing safety seriously and has a public housing safety strategy in place to promote community safety in and around public housing. As a part of this strategy, the department has a red card policy to help manage antisocial behaviour in and around public housing only. The red card policy allows the department, represented by public housing safety officers, to respond and investigate complaints of antisocial behaviour in public housing tenancies in a consistent manner, and take action against tenants who regularly or seriously interfere with the peace and safety of other tenants, neighbours and those in the vicinity. That was the former Labor government's managing antisocial behaviour red card policy. So if this process allows people to acquire 6 demerit points before initiation and action to terminate, how is it that we have tenants in these properties that are getting up to 60 demerit points, destroying the lives of people in their surrounding areas and still able to stay in those properties? How is that happening, Madam Speaker? How is somebody that has a $40,000 debt able to remain in public housing? How is it that someone that fails to maintain their property is able to stay in public housing? Somebody that continually threatens residents, somebody that continually contributes or attracts antisocial behaviour, somebody that ends up being incarcerated for a long sentence is able to maintain their tenancy. When law-abiding, respectful and well-behaved tenants are continually threatened, we continue to see examples of how the former government put the rights of criminals and people that are not a law-abiding citizen above the rights of victims. We all know that shelter is one of the most basic and fundamental human needs, and we've heard people in this chamber talk about how housing may have supported people on a different path than incarceration. We have community standards, Madam Speaker, and there has been a failure, a very big failure over the last 8 years of the former government to understand, to make sure that the community understands what standards are. For all of the dollars that the former government sent out to people in the Northern Territory, to communities in the Northern Territory, to departments in the Northern Territory, they have failed to ensure that every member in the community understands the needs for basic standards. Simple standards, learnt in the early stages of education, can help children grow into responsible, mature adults that then take up tenancies in our public housing system. We don't have kids going to school anymore. School attendance is not a priority for the former Labor government. It is a priority for ours. If a child goes to school, they learn the basic needs, basic rights, the basic reason for washing their hands, for cleaning up after themselves, for being respectful to other people. But we have attendance across the Northern Territory reducing and reducing, meaning that they're not learning those standards. Those standards support growth in people's abilities to look after themselves and look after the tenancies that they maintain. I find it very, very interesting that the member for Goyja talked about education and the importance of getting the community ready to be able to take on these tenancies. That includes making sure children attend school. It includes making sure parents understand that their children need to attend school. Under the last 8 years, the education in the Territory has fallen so far, and I am very, very keen to see this be escalated as a priority again to make sure that children are attending school and learning these needs and these skills to be able to live well in the Northern Territory. We have so much to offer here in the Territory, and all it takes is some lift in education standards, education attendance and growth across the Northern Territory to understand that we all need to live together. I have so many residents in the Fanny Bay electorate that live alongside public housing tenants. I have people come into my electorate office every day complaining about public housing tenants. These are people that have lived there for 20, 30 years, failing to maintain their properties, failing to understand how to respect their neighbours. as a government, we simply need to ensure that people are living to a standard that people expect. We want people to understand that you need to respect your neighbour, no matter who it is. And that's why I support these government reforms. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Yeah.
Member for Karama.
Madam Speaker, look, I don't think it comes as any surprise to the Assembly that I rise to congratulate the Minister on his excellent report, which I believe is just a preliminary step towards rectifying the public housing crisis that has been inflicted on our community by a negligent Labor government, including severely destroying the lifestyle of many residents living in Karama and Malak. And you would be aware, Madam Speaker, that I've raised this issue on their behalf many times in this Assembly, including in my maiden speech, through to many statements, questions and adjournment speeches to this House. And I will continue to do so until this crisis is fixed. So let me address this issue through the lens of empowerment. I say again, the lens of empowerment. And it is worth noting that empowerment was a key theme of the CLP plan that we took to the last election. It was part of our theme. For example, just yesterday, the Minister highlighted how we are going to empower our bush communities and restore control of communities back to local Aboriginal people to help strengthen service delivery, control that Labor took away. And this government is focused on empowering our private sector to drive our economy forward, as highlighted in the successful passage of the Territory Coordinator Bill earlier this week. We have also empowered our wonderful police force and corrections service to better deal with crime across the Territory, with real consequences being introduced via various legislative measures passed over the last 6 months. And I'm proud to have been part of the team to do that. But this empowerment also needs to be given to our local residents in Karama, Malak and Nucky Lagoon and elsewhere. So they are empowered to live their lives free of the trauma and anguish of the crime and antisocial behaviour associated with some, and I emphasise some, of the public housing tenancies across my electorate. They need to be empowered not to have continual fighting, violence, screaming, drunken behaviour in the adjoining property. They need to be empowered not to have adjoining public households host 20 to 30 additional visitors every evening, causing chaos and total neighbourhood destruction. They need to be empowered not to have to suffer continual sleep deprivation for them and their children as a consequence of this unacceptable behaviour. They need to be empowered not to have adjoining public housing tenancies in a total state of disrepair and a blight on their neighbourhood, destroying the value of their own properties. And I can give you an example of some residents in Malak who've struggled to sell their well-maintained house for over 2 years despite having significantly reduced their price. Recently, they thought they had a sale. But just before the sale was finalised, the potential buyers visited the property in the evening and witnessed the neighbouring chaos and violence. They immediately contacted the real estate agent to withdraw their offer, much to the despair of the owners. We need to empower our neighbourhoods so they don't have neighbouring public housing being used as drug houses. We need to empower our taxpayers not to have to carry the cost of sheer vandalism of public housing, and I'm not talking about wear and tear, but vandalism of the order of $50,000 or $100,000 per house. And we need to empower our neighbourhoods, and particularly those in Karama and Malak, to have a public housing density lowered to more community acceptable standards, rather than creating ghetto areas in these suburbs. And I particularly use Fawcett Court and Tabletop Place in Malak as an example of this overdensity. Minister, I was very pleased when you mentioned the need to empower the housing staff to generally enforce consequences for such bad behaviour. And believe it or not, Minister, earlier this morning when I was taking the dogs for a walk, I was approached by a constituent who wanted a chat. He told me he was a previous employer with the Department of Housing with responsibility for managing public housing tenancies. He also told me that he left the agency some 8 years ago due to the frustration because the Labor government had essentially disempowered him and his fellow officers to address unacceptable behaviour and to enforce consequences. He has agreed to send me an email to document his views, and I'll certainly pass that on to you, Minister, and your staff. Madam Speaker, let me address some of the comments raised by the member for 𝒂. He said, housing is a right. Well, let me tell you, member for 𝒂, public housing is a privilege and needs to be treated as such. He asked about the efficacy of evicting irresponsible tenants, citing that they would just end up on the streets. Well, let me remind the member that there is an 8 to 10 year waiting list. And there are many deserving and homeless people on that list that would absolutely cherish the opportunity of being granted public housing. So let me make it very clear. If it comes to a choice of removing irresponsible tenants who continually destroy their neighbourhoods and replacing them with homeless people who will respect the local community, I choose the latter. And I have no doubt that once the first 10 irresponsible tenants are evicted, the word will quickly spread that we now have a government that will not tolerate such criminal and antisocial behaviour. I'd also like to talk about, we had the example, and the member for 𝒂 knows this example, a constituent who told him and has also contacted me, she lives in MLA. She does work out, I think, at 𝒂, which does sometimes have a reputation for a bit of violence and so on. She said she'd much prefer to stay out at 𝒂 than in MLA because of the violence here in MLA. And that is not good, and it's not good for 𝒂, but it's certainly not good for MLA. And another thing is I have 15% Indigenous population. Many of the local Indigenous people in my electorate, they are fed up as well. Long-term Larrakia, been there 30, 40 years. They share the same frustrations. They say, Brian, we've got to stop this. They say, come and bring your minister to sit in my yard at night time and let him hear what I have to put up with. And we may do that if we need to. But maybe I should take the member for 𝒂 along just so he can see firsthand. So just in closing, and I go back to my maiden speech and just a bit of a reminder. For Jim, Barbara and Linda, who have continual antisocial behaviour occurring in neighbouring units in Tabletop Place in MLA, I am still here for you. For the wonderful Moore family in Connor and Magdalen Courts, MLA, who have suffered sleep deprivation for many years from neighbouring antisocial behaviour, I am still here for you. For Kia and Tony, who have had to spend around $40,000 to help improve the safety of their own house in Fig Court, Karama, I am still here for you. For Fula and Drosso, who have had to almost turn their veranda into a prison to stay safe in Kajara Court, Karama, I am still here for you. And to all the other residents that I've sat down with across the electorate, including those living in Dorrigo, Karama, Mahogany and Copra Crescents, Mistletoe Circuit, Sedge Court, Manunda Terrace and Applegum and Kalimnos drivers in Karama, and Abbott, Chambers, Delwood Crescents, Hummel, Maddock, Marshall and Squire Courts and Darwin Street in MLA and Lagoon Road in Nucka Lagoon, I am still here for you. So I just want to commend the Minister. I think what you've outlined is echoing the concerns of my constituents. We are flagging that we are going to do it. We need to rectify it, and you absolutely have the full support of myself, and I believe you have the full support of my electorate. Thank you very much.
Honourable members, I advise of the presence in the gallery of young adults from YouthWorks NT, accompanied by their leaders. On behalf of honourable members, I extend a warm welcome. And also, honourable members, I advise of the presence of Project 21 students from the Down Syndrome Association of the Northern Territory in the gallery. Welcome to Parliament House, welcome to the chamber. It's so lovely to see young Territorians enjoying what we do. Member for Casuarina.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and welcome everyone. Madam Speaker, I rise today with heavy heart to speak on a matter that deeply affecting the lives of countless Territorians, the ongoing public housing crisis. It is a crisis that impacts not just individuals on waiting lists, but also communities where public housing exists, including my own electorate of Casuarina. Under the previous Labor government, legislation and policies were put in place that have created an environment in which managing public housing and tenants residing in these properties has become a tremendous challenge. Madam Speaker, unfortunately, this is a challenge that many of my constituents are facing on a daily basis, and it is one that we must confront head-on. In my electorate, we have multiple properties where tenants are abusing the privilege of public housing. These individuals are not upholding the values that should come with such a privilege, causing endless problems for their neighbours. Madam Speaker, issues such as the pest infestations, antisocial behaviour, and deterioration of community safety have become daily reality of those who live nearby. Not only are these tenants causing harm within the community, but they are also devaluing the real estate value of the surrounding properties. Madam Speaker, many long-term residents who have lived in their homes for decades are now in a position where they are desperate to move, to sell their property and escape the nightmare that their neighbors have become. Yet, they find themselves trapped. The properties are essentially unsellable because of behavior of those nearby in public housing has made that area undesirable. This is not just a person inconvenience for these homeowners. This is a tragedy for our communities. At the same time, we are seeing an increasing number of individuals on the waiting list for public housing, people who are ready, willing and able to respect their privilege of being housed. Madam Speaker, these are the people who understand the value of the stable housing, and they are prepared to care for the property and be good neighbors. And yet, Madam Speaker, they remain on the waiting list while existing housing stock is being misused and abused by those who do not treat it with respect it deserves. Madam Speaker, I want to be clear. My priority is to fight for those on waiting list, those who need a house and are prepared to uphold their responsibilities as a tenants. But the current legislation, the laws that have been put in place, and the policies of inaction that go with them have left me with hands tied. Madam Speaker, these laws prevent us from properly addressing the issues of antisocial behavior and abuse of public housing and deterioration of our neighborhoods. We need to ensure that the public housing serves its intended purpose, to provide shelter and security for those who need it most, while maintaining the well-being and safety of the communities where these homes exist. It is time for us to take action. We cannot allow the current state of affairs to continue. We will support those who need housing while holding tenants accountable for their behavior. We will deliver solutions that are fair, that protect the rights of both residents and the community at large. Madam Speaker, we are taking immediate steps to review the current legislation and structure within the Territory Housing Department. We will continue to work with the local communities and to put in place policies that allow us to manage public housing more effectively. The people of Casuarina and across the territory deserves better. They deserve safe, respectful, and thriving communities. And it is our job to ensure that is what they receive. And Madam Speaker, the CLP government said in 2025, we will be a year of action, certainty, and security. And I think Casuarina and all other suburbs, we need to do something about this. So I have my full support to the Minister. Thank you.
Member for Blaine.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I rise today to support this ministerial on public housing and to speak up for the people of Blaine who for too long were lacking a voice to speak out for them. For too long were the victims of the previous government's failed policies on law and order and public housing. Madam Speaker, I agree with the member for Karama. Public housing is a privilege, not a right. And I will be fighting for the rights of the people of Woodruff, Maldon and Bellarmac to enjoy their homes, to enjoy a good night's sleep without having to suffer the noise and abuse carrying on all night, without having to suffer threats of violence for the simple act of walking out and talking to their neighbour and saying, "Hey mate, I've got to get up tomorrow for work. Do you mind turning it down?" And having things thrown at them, being threatened with sticks, calling the police, our hard-working police, who have assaults, things they need to be worrying about. Instead, they're going and responding to these public housing disturbances, all because of the failed policies of the previous government. Shame. I lived in public housing myself when I was a child. My mother was escaping domestic violence, and we went into public housing until we could find our own housing. I understand the value of public housing. I understand the need that it fulfills. But public housing is a privilege, not a right. We are a compassionate society. We are a wealthy society. And as that, we seek to look after those who are less well off. We seek to give people a hand up, not a handout. But this is not a privilege without limitations. It is not a licence to terrorise your neighbours. If the family member has a house in town, it's not a licence to go there and use it as a crash pad with half of the family and then terrorise all the neighbours. This is not how we live in society. All we ask is the very simple expectation that we live in society together. That people who have to get up in the morning, get up at 5, 6 a.m. in the morning, get ready, go to work all day, providing services to our society, educating our kids, looking after our sick people, all sorts of things. They deserve to have a good night's sleep. They don't deserve to be kept up by people yelling, screaming, fighting, drinking, carrying on, and taking away from the hard work of our police who honestly have better things to do than to go and tell people to quieten down and take it inside. The citizens of Blaine, there are so many stories that I could go through, and they all have a common theme after a while, and I will come to that common theme. Michelle in Malden, I was having a mobile office in Malden, and this poor lady came up to me. She was on the verge of a breakdown. As she was talking to me, just tears streaming from her face. This poor woman just could not sleep because of the carry-on that was happening from the house across the road from her. And she lived by herself. She's not a young person. She's, in middle age. And she was too scared to go out and say anything. In fact, she was terrified to say anything at all to anyone but me, or call the police. But the trouble is, she'd say, well, I call the police, they come, things quieten down, and then the police have to go, and then it all fires up again. And this poor woman was crying on the streets of Malden, begging me, you have to do something. I can't live like this. Please do something. Madam Speaker, that is why I'm here. I am here to speak up for the people of Blaine. Al in Woodruff, what a champion. He's an Indigenous man. He works out on the mine sites, delivering the precious metals that we need for our society. He comes home, all he wants to do is just enjoy a beer and the sanctity and amenity of his own house. What happens instead? The public housing next door, unfortunately the high-density public housing, people come in from out of town and just kick off. And I actually, during the campaign, I went and sat there with him one night. And what I saw through his fence next door was disgusting. Stolen cars coming and going, drinking, fighting, and worst of all, young children, toddlers, being exposed to all of this violence. That is no way for young children to live their life. I understand what it's like as a child to be exposed to domestic violence, to be exposed to this kind of behaviour, and it is not something that children should have to deal with. Children have the right. The member for 𝒂 talks about rights. Children have a right to grow up in a house that is calm, peaceful, where there are consistent rules, where they get all the food that they need. They're not scared about being physically assaulted or sexually assaulted, where they can grow and thrive to the fullest of their potential. So Al from Woodruff, I'm here for you and I will continue to fight for you. The people on Sibbald in Woodruff, another address that I've been to many times, and I would love to be there for happy reasons. I would love to be there celebrating, announcing a pizza in the park or a breakfast, something positive. But unfortunately, more times than I care to think about, I found myself there late at night with my family at home, talking to the neighbours, while one time there was even a stolen car, set alight, burning down across the road from these poor people. These are people who bought a home many years ago, some of them under the CLP government back in the 90s, when Woodruff was an upmarket place, a desirable place to live. The equivalent at the time of what 𝒂 is now, or Muirhead. And now these people are suffering. Luckily, we work with the local police, and from things quieten down. But then all it takes is, a trigger event, a group come in from out of town, and everything fires up again. Baldwin Drive in Woodruff. I hear you. I stand up for you. Bombax in Malden. Melastoma and Staghorn. Staghorn, I'm working with the community housing providers to improve the amenity there. The member for 𝒂 said that we would be evicting people from public housing into homelessness. But I say to you, Madam Speaker, I say to this House, what about the 10 years' worth of people on the backlog who are already homeless right now. Right now, we have 10 years of people who don't have a home. And at the same time, we have people living in homes who don't respect the home. Sorry, let me back up. We have people living in homes and the visitors to those homes don't respect the homes, don't respect the neighbours, and the system that the previous government set up continues that, empowers that behaviour, shields them from consequences. No more. This government has drawn a line in the sand and said no more. Public housing is a privilege, not a right. With privileges come responsibilities. A very basic responsibility that I think most people would accept is the responsibility to maintain your yard, the responsibility not to damage the house, a responsibility to manage the visitors that come to the house and their behaviour, a responsibility to manage the consumption of alcohol. Now, at this point, I do want to make a comment. I have spent a lot of time with the tenants of some of these properties, and I will say that sometimes, and quite often, the visitors themselves are as much a victim of the visitors as anyone else, as the neighbours. Madam Speaker, I seek an extension of time.
There are no extensions for a ministerial report.
Darn it, okay. In that case, I will finish up and I endorse our government's response to public housing. Thank you.
Member for Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today with deep concern over the public housing reforms proposed by the CLP government. These reforms are far too focused on punitive measures and fail to address the underlying causes of social inequality, structural disadvantage and systemic failures within the housing sector. We all know, and we've heard in this House, that safe and stable housing is essential for the wellbeing of any community. We know it impacts everything: health, education, employment and community safety. We heard that from the Minister this morning. We know that overcrowded, inadequate and inappropriate housing is a major factor contributing to our health crisis, our domestic violence crisis, our safety crisis and our education crisis. Without a safe, appropriate place to live, we put our most vulnerable people at risk. You can't get up and go to school if you're living in an overcrowded and inadequate shelter. Having a safe place to live is a basic human right and a foundation for people to live happy, healthy lives. And if we want to improve safety in our communities, I agree that we have to address the housing crisis head on. There's no question we have to do something about it to address it. But what's needed is a better resourced and effective way of managing long-term, ongoing and systemic issues in how we deliver public housing in the Northern Territory. As the Minister and other members in this House have said, there are empty houses, there are unsafe houses, there are uncared for houses, there are vulnerable and at-risk tenants, there's inappropriate behaviour, there's tenants crying out for support that are left without it, there's damage to properties which is not repaired for months on end, and there's a huge waiting list. The number one issue in my electorate is housing. And the number one complaint my constituents have is that they call all the right people at all the right times, trying to prevent and respond to issues with their own public housing or a neighbour, and the system lets them down every time. Police do not talk to housing, and housing do not talk to mental health services, despite this being their obligation. The Minister is right that solutions include accountability, but that accountability rests first with him and his department. Evicting people because you failed to provide adequate support is not the recipe for a healthy or safe society. Madam Speaker, we all need to be accountable for our behaviour, including us in this chamber. The current situation in public housing is totally unacceptable, but blaming the individuals in those houses for systemic issues in the mismanagement of housing properties by the government and the department inappropriately shifts accountability from those who are responsible in government to individuals and does nothing to fix the situation we are in. Let's talk about proper accountability. Accountability means taking responsibility for your behaviour and then doing something to address it. Evicting people and fining people does not create accountability, and if we fail to implement proper accountability, we risk an increase in homelessness, an increase in overcrowding and an increase in social dislocation. Like everyone in this chamber, I have many, many constituents who raise issues with me about public housing. Tenants, neighbours, families, people who are incredibly frustrated about what is happening and what is not happening. People who've reached out for help over and over again and not got it. People who try to raise concerns, as I said, about what is going on with police and with housing to no effect. In my electorate, in the last fortnight, there was an alleged domestic violence killing in a public house. And in relation to that house, so many people have come to me with the list of times they contacted police, they contacted housing, they looked for help for people to no effect. People told me that housing told them they hadn't heard anything from police. People told me that there were so many chances for intervention in this situation that didn't happen and tragedy ensued. We cannot have any more houses where people are killed because the support they need is not there. But evicting tenants without addressing the reasons behind rent arrears or antisocial behaviour will not fix this. Evicting people only displaces the problem. The social costs of homelessness, such as increased reliance on emergency services, healthcare costs and social instability, are far greater than the costs of supporting tenants to actually meet their responsibilities. We know that homelessness leads to deteriorating health, increased crime and social isolation, strains social services and affects the quality of life for many families, both in and outside those public houses. These outcomes are preventable, Madam Speaker, when accountability is coupled with support and with intervention. And to hear the Minister say there will be no more compassion, and to hear that statement receive cheers across this chamber saddens me. It distresses me and it angers me. Madam Speaker, when did compassion become a dirty word? There is no reason we cannot approach this issue with compassion, with clarity and with processes that will ensure accountability, will ensure safety and will ensure real change for our community. Yesterday we heard the member for Mulka say in this chamber that what we need is acts of kindness and respect. That is what we need most in the Northern Territory. So what happens to those families who cannot afford to pay rent due to the rent increase? Will the head tenant be held responsible for the household debt? Will they be saddled with the debt or eventually jailed? Locking up people because you failed to provide adequate support you're obligated to provide is not the answer. We know this is not just about putting a roof over people's head. This is about giving families the stability they need to escape cycles of violence and instability. We know we can't have a thriving community if people are living in overcrowded homes or houses that are falling apart. We know that secure quality housing is directly linked to better outcomes in terms of safety, mental health and community cohesion. We know that when families have a safe, stable place to live, they're able to focus on the other incredibly important areas that this government is committed to, like education and employment. I also heard the Minister say that there'll be increased powers being granted to public housing service officers, and of course safety in public housing is essential, but we must avoid militarising the response to social issues. I heard the Minister say that these people will not be social workers, but will they be trained in conflict resolution, in cultural competency, in how to support vulnerable populations? We need proper approaches to address these issues so that we can actually deal with them, not continually make them worse and continue in this cyclical, ineffective and punitive response to the housing crisis. I absolutely agree that we need to address the crisis in public housing in the Northern Territory, the homelessness crisis, the community safety crisis. And in the spirit of the member for Mulka's motion on the Aboriginal Justice Agreement last night, we need to work together. I call on the government to work with the expert and long-standing housing service providers to better understand the complex nature of the Northern Territory's housing and homelessness crisis. I urge the government to work with NT Shelter, with NTCOS, with Aboriginal Housing NT, with Yulirung, with Mission Australia, with YWCA and with many others. The specialist workers in these services will be impacted by the government's decision. these government's decisions. We need to keep these specialist workers in the NT. We need to look after them. We need to make sure that changes to the approach in housing and homelessness policy does not impact negatively on these workers and they're able to do their job. This approach being proposed will not support those hard-working frontline public housing staff, and it will not support those sector workers. It will put additional pressure on them. Madam Speaker, this knee-jerk response will only lead to an increase in homelessness, overcrowding and social dislocation. Just as we are talking about accountability for public tenants, all of us in this chamber must be accountable to make decisions on complex social issues, decisions that will work to make our community safer. I urge the Minister to reconsider this approach and think carefully about its long-term consequences. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Wangari.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today to support the territory housing reforms that the Minister for Housing, Local Government and Community Development is proposing in these amendments in the Act. Madam Speaker, for far too long, the residents in Wangari and Lianya surrounding these public houses and units have had enough with the antisocial behaviour, mistreatment of the public assets and the financial burden of non-payment of rent, including maintenance of the damaged properties. Madam Speaker, I support housing for those who are vulnerable and social housing because, Madam Speaker, I'm a product of social housing. I lived in a house in Rapid Creek for the first 9 years of my life, and my father lived in that house for decades before raising his older children. But our family did not abuse the opportunity of living in this public house. My parents ensured they paid their rent on time, they maintained their property with pride and did not commit any antisocial behaviour. Madam Speaker, I wish to share a constituent's concern regarding antisocial behaviour in my electorate and brought to my attention her terrible experience living next door to a public house. She reached out because she had previously wrote to the last Labor Housing Minister and the last Labor member and fell on deaf ears. Madam Speaker, she wrote, "I'm writing to you to bring to your attention and plea for your assistance the matter of continued and ongoing distress caused by antisocial behaviour from a resident of public housing. I've also been writing to the Department for Public Housing over the years, and sometimes, like my recent attempt on the 15th of August, I don't even receive a response. I live in Lianya, and the behaviour of our neighbour has completely and utterly ruined our first experience of home ownership and demolished any quality of life we hope for as a couple. I've attached correspondence, which there are many, dated from the 11th of March 2024, which I sent to the Minister for Housing and the member for Wangari, which details the events we've been subjected to up and until the point for your reference. And there were many, many incidences listed on those reports. I've also attached a response from the Minister Office and a recent letter addressed to yourself, which details events up to and highlights the impacts in our lives. She wrote in one of the letters that there were 22 incidents within a 7-week period. Madam Speaker, she writes, "My partner and I purchased our home nearly 2.5 years ago in the hopes of making this our first family home. We've since agreed to postpone these plans, and I can't, in good conscience, willingly expose any child to the type of behaviour we're subjected to witness on a weekly basis. Our dreams have not been utterly crushed, but also directly mocked by the perpetrator of the behaviour. We've been so completely and deeply hurt by everything that has happened in the last few years, and that I don't think we can continue to live in the house, but we're not in a financial position to get out. I honestly don't know what else to do anymore, but I can't keep living like this." The letters enclosed are long, so I do appreciate your time in understanding the full scope of the ongoing issues. Madam Speaker, I wish to thank that resident for following up on this matter with this new government, and I can assure her and her family we are reforming public housing and taking action. We're taking action to give you certainty that your first home buying experience is fixed and that in the future you'll be able to raise your family in peace and come to love living in Leanya. Madam Speaker, another constituent who was 63 years of age only recently came into my office 3 weeks ago and wanted to ensure this government does do something about the antisocial behaviour. He explained to me in his small court of 13 houses, 4 are public houses, which once were 5, and to him it seems to be unfair ratio over the years. Every one of those houses has been involved in drug activity and antisocial behaviour in one way or another, and most recently, one of the occupants in the street were apparently raided and taken into custody. Another had a hydro set up and plants confiscated, which a few years ago was also charged. Madam Speaker, he goes on in his correspondence to say, we've been subjected to antisocial behaviour over many years, from constant fighting, foul language, persons armed with knives running up and down the street, and recently vacated a house was frequently visited by police to deal with a male individual who was constantly arrested, once in the front yard of his verge. Prior to that, we had a tenant that at the same house who had a small LED light on her gate to alert people she was open for business, was also arrested and taken into custody for drug possession. She had a young male friend who used to visit, and it was every time fighting the moment he arrived, often early Sunday mornings. Territory Housing seems to introduce these unsavoury people time and time again. Frequent non-resident traffic in the street is ongoing, a lot of short visits. Dogs at large with absolutely no care factor, given they were removed by council and then shortly after they got another 2. He wrote, only last night they had a group of 5 individuals around midnight yelling and screaming for an hour and a half while he had to get up at 4:30 a.m. to go to work. Madam Speaker, this constituent is not singling out anyone out, as he has another public house behind him who is terrific, where he's resided for around 25 years and understands the issue and the logistics of the welfare system, but he feels it seems to favour them and not himself as a working taxpayer, and all he wants is a few of the elderly residents in his area is a quiet lifestyle in his later years and not feeling uncomfortable in his own home. Madam Speaker, this is only 2 examples I've shared today, but there are numerous stories across the Wangari electorate and across the territory, as we've heard from my other colleagues. Madam Speaker, there's so many other residents in my electorate who are in public housing and do the right thing. These are wonderful senior village people on the Leanya Drive and the others that live in the Wangari units on Trail Road, who've done the right thing, but as these units age, they've asked for maintenance but have been waiting for years and just give up. Madam Speaker, social housing should empower most vulnerable members of our community, and it does for those who do not abuse the opportunity of living in public housing. Madam Speaker, I support the public housing reforms the Minister has proposed so that the Wangari electorate can return to its wonderful previous reputation, a place to raise your family in peace and live and work safely. Thank you for your time.
Are there any other speakers? Member for Nightcliff.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And apologies, I did not get time to print this off. Ooh, and I don't have my glasses on. So I rise to speak on this ministerial report on housing. I would like to start by saying that, yes, it is really important, crucial in fact, that the government is taking action on public housing. I have people who live in public housing come and talk to me every day, raising concerns of their safety, their well-being, and just the general quality of life in public housing and also those around it. In fact, helping public housing residents and people around public housing makes up the absolute bulk of the work that I and my staff do in my electorate office. There are serious problems with our public housing. We have damaged houses, housing that is unsuitable for people with disabilities, and people waiting up to 6 years just before getting transferred. I was glad to hear the Minister And others in this chamber say that these so-called the problem tenants are in the minority, because that's true and it really must be empathised. We in this chamber must not play into the demonisation of people living in public housing. They are our constituents too. And Madam Speaker, I am concerned about calls to fasten the eviction process for people with rental debts, which effectively means forcing them to become homeless. How is this a solution? I don't understand. They will just continue to have a debt and also not have a home. I also heard calls for a range of other vulnerable people to be pushed out of their homes, seemingly onto the street. How is this going to solve anything? I am concerned about the oversimplification of this issue heard in the chamber here and in the CLP's rhetoric. It's not that Labor were weak on this issue and the CLP are strong. Trying to frame this issue as either you are strong or you are empathetic and weak is a totally unhelpful framework, I think, for this to be viewed. And I fear that we will never actually solve this problem if that is how it is continued to be seen. Absolutely, Labor failed on housing, not disputing that. But previous CLP governments have also failed in housing, and that is the truth. So of course we need accountability. We need accountability for people living in public housing. They deserve to be safe. And once again, I speak to them every day. So sure, pushing people onto the street to be homeless is not a solution, but also neither is failing to address the structural problems that have got us here in the first place. My question to the CLP is, what are your structural solutions? What are your investments in strong alcohol policy here in the NT? You've repealed the minimum floor price. That is not an alcohol policy. Where are your investments in alcohol programs and education, in youth diversion programs, investment in more housing, instead of the big complexes where many vulnerable people are all then just shoved in together with no support networks? Where are your investments in domestic family sexual violence services and programs for young parents to help them become good role models for their children? Where are your investments in increasing wages and reducing the cost of homes and living so that hardworking people can own their own houses, not just handouts for property investors, and not have to live in public housing? Where is the real plan? Because all I've seen so far, and all my constituents have seen, is this new government come in full of bluster, passing legislation that is all stick and no carrot. I have seen nothing come before this Assembly that actually tackles the source of the issue that we're facing. And it is of continuing frustration of the public to see this. We want action, and I don't want just talk about action and being tough. I want action that solves the core issues, and we have not seen this here. I also want to point out the fact in this issue with housing that probably one of the biggest factors is the increasing privatisation of public housing. One of the largest issues is that the Department of Housing, they have a duty of care, whereas private sector providers do not, or they don't think that they do. And so people living in privately run affordable housing do not see the investments in the safety for residents because the private organisations don't want to spend money and they aren't obliged to. That is a really big problem in my electorate. Previous governments have wanted to rid themselves of the responsibilities of running public housing, and both Labor and the CLP have been notorious for selling off public housing or contracting it out to private organisations. This has created such a problem because these housing providers are not providing the same levels of security because they're not obliged to. And the government knew this when they contracted them out. So now innocent tenants are falling into the gaps where suddenly no one is responsible to ensure their security and safety in their housing complexes that are run by private groups. And I speak to these tenants every single day. I'm holding tenant meetings with the tenants, with providers, with representatives from other orgs. I'm trying to get the police and my local community safety reps to come to the meetings because this is such a problem and I'm working so hard in my electorate to solve this. But it's not going to be helped by punitive measures or a lack of action on the real drivers from the government. I also am concerned that these changes are only going to lead to an increase in the levels of incarceration. If people do not have a safe home, there are more risks of them becoming incarcerated, and the stats absolutely play this out. And as I mentioned the other day in one of the panels on crime and safety that I ran in my electorate, Rocket Bretherton, a formerly incarcerated woman who now works for Justice Reform Initiative, she shared at that panel that the #1 thing that women in jail say would prevent them from returning to prison
is safe housing. So what will become of these women when they leave jail and under the changes we've just heard that their house will be taken away from them? What will they do for 9 years while they have to wait to return on the list to public housing? We just know that this will make them improving their lives almost impossible and they will end up incarcerated again. It's not the solution to our problems. So look, to close, I just want us to remember two things. Firstly, the challenges we're seeing in public housing come from a minority of people. And we've been hearing about, yes, the hardworking, tax-paying people who own their own homes or rent privately all throughout Darwin. They deserve to be safe. But tax-paying, hardworking Territorians also live inside public housing. I had someone recently who spoke to me, an elderly retired man who worked in the trades for his whole entire life, paid taxes. He's living in public housing and he feels totally let down. Why is he forced to become stigmatised and suffer just because he lives in public housing? He also worked hard for his entire life and paid taxes, and they deserve better from our government. I didn't get time to finish my speech, and I'm not that great at speaking ad lib, but I want to say I'm thanking the Minister for bringing housing reform. We do desperately need it. I'm incredibly concerned about this sort of stick rather than carrot approach. The framing of this like, we can't have empathy, that's too weak, we're the strong ones, just totally misses what the issues are. So I would strongly encourage the CLP to have less of this rhetoric of how tough they are and actually go to the ground, have more meetings with orgs and public housing tenants to look at the structural issues that we should be tackling to see a difference. Thank you.
Member for Sanderson.
I rise today to speak in support of the Minister and his new department for the proactive work that has been done for the last 6 months. A house is more than just a structure. It is a fundamental human need, a place of safety and stability, and the foundation for our families, our children, and our future. Public housing plays a crucial role in ensuring that every individual, regardless of their financial situation, has access to safe and affordable shelter. It is a system designed to support our most vulnerable, families on low incomes, seniors, people with disabilities, and those experiencing hardship. But when this system is not working as it should, when public housing becomes a source of community distress rather than stability, then we must take action. In my electorate of Sanderson, we see the benefits of public housing every day. It allows hardworking families to have a place to call home, provides security for seniors, and offers a fresh start to those in need. However, we also see the challenges. Some public housing properties are being misused. Some tenants, instead of valuing the home they have been given, are creating serious problems for their neighbors and the wider community. Loud parties, vandalism, drug use, and antisocial behavior, these are not the values we want in our neighborhoods. Unfortunately, we know that some tenants are allowing visitors who bring crime and disorder into our streets. This is not just a housing issue. It is a community safety issue. I have spoken to residents across Sanderson, families who cannot sleep because of the noise, parents who fear letting their children play outside, and elderly residents who feel trapped in their own homes. This is unacceptable. Public housing should be a place of security, not a source of fear. At the heart of this issue are our children. A home is meant to be a place where children feel safe, where they can study, rest, and grow into responsible adults. But when public housing is used irresponsibly, when homes become hotspots for crime and violence, the ones who suffer the most are the innocent children caught in the middle. Imagine a child trying to do homework in a house where fights break out in the front yard. Imagine a young person growing up thinking that violence, drug use, and disorder are normal parts of life. When children are exposed to this kind of environment, their future is at risk. They struggle in school, their mental health suffers, and they are more likely to become involved in crime themselves. We cannot allow this cycle to continue. So what can we do? Firstly, We must strengthen accountability, which is exactly what the Minister and the Department is doing. Public housing is a privilege, not a right to be abused. If tenants are engaging in criminal activity or allowing antisocial visitors, there must be consequences. We need stricter enforcement of tenancy agreements and swifter action against those who repeatedly break the rules. Secondly, we must support those who want to do better. Not every struggling public housing tenant is a problem. Many simply need guidance, support, and access to services to help them turn their lives around. Thirdly, we must stand together as a community. If you see something that threatens the safety and well-being of our neighborhoods, speak up. Report issues to authorities and support initiatives that promote safer and stronger suburbs. Public housing is meant to be a solution, not a problem. It should provide stability, not chaos. It should be a place where children thrive, not where they learn the wrong lessons about life. We must ensure that public housing in Sanderson and across Northern Territory serves its true purpose, providing safe, stable, and respectful living conditions for those in need while protecting the wider community from harm. Together, we can make public housing work for the people who need it most. Together, we can build a community that is safe, supportive, and strong. I thank the Minister for the proactive steps to address these issues, and I commend the work that the Department is doing on this as well. Thank you.
Are there any other speakers? Member for Goyder.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to make my contribution on this important ministerial report by the Minister for Housing. Madam Speaker, I talk to all of my colleagues in this chamber, and by and large, the issue I hear time and time again is more and more issues with public housing. When I speak to the passionate member for Karama, he tells me time and time again, I say, how's it all going in Karama? And he lets me know in no uncertain terms that it's like a war zone. It is an absolute travesty what has been allowed to occur for a significant period of time now, where ordinary people who just want to get on with their lives and go to work and go home and have a beer and have a nice sleep get disturbed time and time again. We have tremendous courage and leadership in the member for Drysdale, and when he gets up and he talks to me and I say, Clinton, how is it going in Drysdale? And he says, not as good as Goyder. And I say, what do you mean? And it's time and time again, it's public housing. There is significant issues. I believe his electorate has over 17% of all the public housing in the territory. And Blaine is about 18%. The member for Blaine is a passionate advocate for improvement. For too long, the people of Maldon, Woodruff, Rosebery and Bellamac have suffered under the lack of enforcement in the public housing space. Now, Madam Speaker, it's not all doom and gloom. I have public housing in my electorate, and Madam Speaker, they are fantastic. The people who have these houses in Humpty Doo, they look after them, they have lovely gardens, they're great people, and time and time again when I've been out door knocking the few houses I can get to, they say hello, invite me in for a cup of tea, and we have a chat. These are people who are using the service the way it should be used. They're respectful, they're incredibly grateful to be provided this service. They're very nice tenants, they look after the place, they're very respectful neighbours, and they just do a fantastic job. And Madam Speaker, they are the bastion of what public housing should be. Helping people who may not be able to afford their own home, get their feet up, get them a roof over their head, give them some stability in their lives. And I love it, Madam Speaker. And I just wish that it was being treated the same way across all of the territory. It breaks my heart to know that there's families out there sleeping rough, sleeping in their cars, who would be ideal tenants, as the member for Karama has said. And instead they're forced to live without public housing because we just do not have enough yet. Meanwhile, there are people who are abusing this privilege to be housed by the government or at a reduced cost and just destroying the place. It honestly, it's horrendous. When I talk to the member for Casuarina and I ask him, how's it going in Casuarina? And he tells me, not great. And I say, what's wrong? And he says, time and time again, public housing. When I talk to the member for Wanguri. And I say, Oly, how's life in Wanguri? And she says, time and time again, not as great as Goyder. And I say, what's wrong, Oly? And she says, it's public housing again. And it's an issue that takes up a significant amount of time. And honestly, talking to some of the people who have reached out to me who live in public housing, and they're all next door to a public housing, and they've described some of these nights where it's 2 a.m, you've got a baby, she can't get to sleep because they're blasting music, you've called the cops, you've tried everything, you've gone knocking on their door, begging them to please, can we maybe turn down the music at least, and just getting refused or getting threatened with threats of violence, and people are scared to go to work. They don't want to leave their house in case their neighbour's there to retaliate against them for just wanting to be able to get a good night's sleep. And Madam Speaker, it's simply not good enough. I have complete faith in the Minister for Housing that he will take the steps needed to improve the situation right across the territory. And Madam Speaker, it's not going to be an overnight fix. Unfortunately, there is no magic bullet. But what it will be is a series of reforms, and it'll take time. Unfortunately, everything in government takes a bit of time, but we will start to see change. And Madam Speaker, I'm incredibly proud to be part of this CLP team that is part of that change. I want to make sure that when we reflect back on our time here, and in 3 years' time I say, member for Drysdale, how's life in Drysdale? And he'll say, almost as good as Goyder. When I talk to the member for Blaine, he's going to say, I haven't had a housing complaint in a whole day, rather than saying he's had 6 this morning. You know, when I talk to the electorate officers in their offices and I say, what's the main issue that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis? They say public housing. Madam Speaker, unfortunately, the people in Drysdale and Blaine, they haven't been able to have the luxury of being able to come to me and talk to me about their pet crocodiles and how important it is to them out in the rural area. Instead, they're dealing with day in, day out, a war zone. And Madam Speaker, we live in what's meant to be a first world country. We're meant to be living in a place of paradise and hopes and dreams, not a place where you can't go to bed, not a place where you can't have friends and family visit from down south out of embarrassment that your neighbours might be fighting or they might be drinking or blasting music. And Madam Speaker, it breaks my heart to know, again, that those families and people who do need the services are being excluded for it because the current tenants have been warned time and time again. I believe it's up to 60 times some of these people have had warnings. Now, Madam Speaker, if you got warned 60 times on anything and you were still allowed to stay there, why would you change your behaviour? If there's no consequence for your actions, why would you do anything about it? And Madam Speaker, we're going to bring in the consequences. We're going to show people, and I do believe the member for Karama said earlier that once we make one eviction and the second eviction and the third, and once that's happened, everyone else will realise, oh no, the consequences are coming. We need to respect the place we're being given. It is time and time again the lack of action that's been taking place over the last 8 years that we are now dealing with. This wasn't an issue that popped up overnight, Madam Speaker. It has been growing and growing and growing. And even though, again, I would like to credit the Minister for Housing that the public housing in my electorate is wonderful, they are lovely, they are great people, but it's a sad story every time I talk to my fellow colleagues about what's going on in their electorates. And Madam Speaker, we're close enough to 12. Thank you.